April 18, 1943. 0935 hours, 6,500 feet above Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto shifted uncomfortably in the cramped passenger compartment of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, his swollen feet throbbing inside boots he'd already changed twice that morning. At 59 years old, with a failing heart that couldn't push fluid through his extremities properly, the 4-hour flight from Rabaul had become an ordeal. The curvature of the bomber's greenhouse fuselage pressed against him, and his ceremonial katana, required for this inspection tour, dug into his side with every adjustment of position. Through the bomber's windows, he could see the second Betty carrying Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki and the rest of his staff flying parallel, perhaps 200 meters to starboard. Above and around them, 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters wove protective patterns through the morning sky. Right on schedule. Yamamoto had always been punctual, a habit that had served him well throughout his distinguished career. They were approaching the Imperial Navy Air Base at Bougainville at precisely 35 hours, exactly as the encoded message had specified. The formation began its descent. Yamamoto pressed his face closer to the window, watching the green jungle canopy rise up to meet them. In minutes, he would be on the ground, inspecting troops who desperately needed encouragement after the grinding defeats at Guadalcanal. The men needed to see their commander-in-chief, needed to hear that the war could still be won, even though Yamamoto himself harbored no such illusions. A shadow flashed across the Betty's fuselage. Yamamoto glanced up through the greenhouse canopy, frowning. One of their Zero escorts was dangerously close, way out of position, nearly on top of them. What kind of formation flying was this? Which pilot was that careless? He leaned forward, trying to identify the aircraft through the curved glass. Then his world tilted. The Betty's pilot threw the bomber into a violent power dive without warning. Yamamoto's stomach lurched as the horizon rotated 90 degrees. The green island and blue ocean spun into view where the sky had been seconds before. His hand instinctively reached for something to brace against as loose maps and papers flew through the compartment. Another aircraft roared overhead, so close the Betty shuddered in its wake. The sound cut through the droning of their own engines, a deeper, more powerful thunder. Yamamoto caught only a glimpse, nothing more than a black silhouette streaking past at impossible speed, but the image seared itself into his mind with perfect clarity. Twin booms, central nacelle, distinctive forked tail, a P-38 Lightning. The realization struck him with the force of physical impact. His chest tightened. The Americans, here, now, at this exact moment, at this exact location. The last time Admiral Yamamoto checked, the Nipponese Air Force wasn't flying any of those, which meant his worst. Fear, the nightmare scenario he'd warned about for 3 years, had just materialized at 6,500 feet above Bougainville. The Americans had found him. More than that, they had sent fighters with the range to intercept him 435 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. Fighters that shouldn't have been able to reach this far into Japanese-controlled territory. Twin-engine fighters that every Japanese intelligence assessment had dismissed as heavy, vulnerable, unsuited for long-range operations. The mathematics of his situation crystallized with terrible clarity. If American fighters were here, in strength, with enough fuel to fight and return, then everything Japanese planners believed about Allied capabilities was wrong. The 1,000-mile combat radius, the fuel calculations, the defensive perimeters, all of it, fiction. Through the chaos of the diving bomber, Yamamoto's mind, trained at the Imperial Naval Academy, sharpened at Harvard University, refined through decades of strategic planning, processed the implications with the precision of a mathematical proof. The Americans had cracked their codes. They knew his schedule. They knew his route. They knew which aircraft carried him. And they had sent the one fighter in their arsenal capable of executing an interception at this distance. The P-38 Lightning, the strange twin-boom fighter Japanese pilots had initially mocked when it first appeared over the Solomons in late 1942. Yamamoto remembered the intelligence reports. His staff had analyzed the new American fighter with the confidence of men who knew their enemy's limitations. The P-38 appears to lack any distinctive features other than speed at great altitudes and very high diving speed, one assessment had concluded. Japanese pilots had shot down many of the early Lightnings, gleefully reporting that the American pilots tried to dogfight with Zeros, a fatal mistake. The reports described a clumsy aircraft, heavy and unmaneuverable, flown by inexperienced pilots who didn't understand their own machine. But Yamamoto had spent enough time in America to know better than to underestimate American engineering. From 1919 to 1921, he'd studied at Harvard University, lived in Washington as a naval attaché, toured the country extensively. He'd visited oil fields in Texas and Mexico, watched Detroit factories produce automobiles on assembly lines, witnessed an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan possessed. He'd tried to warn them. God, how he'd tried. In 1940, standing before a classroom of schoolchildren in his hometown of Nagaoka, he'd spoken words that had earned him death threats from ultranationalists. Japan cannot beat America, therefore Japan should not fight America. When Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro had pressed him about the prospects of war with the United States, Yamamoto had been brutally honest. If I am told to fight regardless of consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. His prediction had been horrifyingly accurate. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. 6 months later, almost to the day, Midway, June 4-7, 1942. The tide had turned exactly when he said it would. Japan had run wild. Now Japan was running out of everything except courage. And courage without fuel, without ships, without aircraft, was just a path to honorable death. The Betty leveled out, still diving but controlled now. Through the window, Yamamoto caught glimpses of the desperate battle unfolding around his aircraft. Zero fighters twisted and turned, their pilots executing the tight maneuvers that had made them legendary. Tracer fire arced across the morning sky. An explosion bloomed orange against the blue. But the P-38s, there were multiple contacts now. Yamamoto could see at least 4 of the distinctive twin-tailed silhouettes, weren't engaging in turning fights. They were using tactics Japanese pilots hadn't encountered before. Diving attacks. Boom and zoom. Using their speed and altitude advantage to strike and climb away before the nimble Zeros could bring their superior maneuverability to bear. American pilots had learned. They'd studied their aircraft's strengths. They'd abandoned European dogfighting doctrine and created something new, something that played to the P-38's advantages. Yamamoto felt the aircraft shudder. The sound was wrong, not the normal vibration of engines and airframe, but something irregular, mechanical, urgent. His pilot was screaming something, words lost in the chaos of combat and failing systems. The Betty's right engine trailed black smoke. Through the greenhouse canopy, Yamamoto saw the jungle rising up faster than it should, the green canopy filling his field of vision. In that moment, the final moment, though he didn't yet know it, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood with absolute clarity that his death would prove everything he'd tried to tell his countrymen. The Americans had sent fighters nearly 500 miles to intercept him. They had calculated his position with precision that suggested they were reading Japanese communications as easily as morning newspapers. They had committed resources to kill one man that most nations would reserve for destroying entire bases. This was American industrial warfare. Not efficiency, not elegance, not tactical brilliance. Raw, overwhelming, inexhaustible capacity applied without hesitation or restraint. If they could send fighters this far, on a mission this specific, for a target this singular, then what else could they do? What other assumptions about Allied limitations were equally wrong? The Americans hadn't just sent the P-38s to kill him. They'd sent them to deliver a message to every Japanese commander who would hear of this mission. Nowhere is safe. No distance is too far. No target is beyond reach. The man who had studied at Harvard, who had toured American oil fields, who had played poker in Washington drawing rooms, who had warned his government that America's industrial might made war unwinnable. That man was about to become proof of his own predictions. Killed by a weapon that represented everything he'd tried to make Tokyo understand about American capacity. The P-38 Lightning that had flashed overhead wasn't just a fighter aircraft. It was a mathematical equation made manifest in aluminum and aviation fuel. It was the solution to a problem Japanese planners said couldn't be solved. It was industrial capacity transformed into combat radius, factory production turned into strategic reach. Yamamoto had spent years trying to explain to military hawks and ultranationalists that America fought differently. Not better, necessarily. Not with superior courage or tactical genius, but with resources so vast that they redefined what was possible. They didn't build fighters that could turn tighter than zeros. They built fighters that didn't need to turn, that could simply outrun, outdive, and outlast anything in the sky. The Betty bomber shook violently. Metal screamed. The world outside the windows became a chaotic blur of green jungle and blue sky, rotating sickeningly. Yamamoto felt the impact of something against the fuselage. Cannon fire, machine gun rounds. He couldn't tell. The noise was overwhelming. He thought of his wife, Reiko, whom he'd married 40 years ago. He thought of his children. He thought of the fleet he commanded, now fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose productive capacity he'd witnessed firsthand in Detroit and Texas. Most of all, he thought of the letter he'd written years ago, the one where he'd calculated that defeating America required marching into Washington and signing the treaty in the White House. He'd meant it as a warning, an impossible condition meant to demonstrate the futility of war with the United States. Instead, ultranationalists had quoted it as proof of his confidence. They'd understood nothing. 250 caliber bullets, fired from a P-38 Lightning's nose-mounted machine guns, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, ended Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's life before the Betty bomber crashed into the Bougainville jungle. His body would be found the next day by a Japanese recovery team, still strapped in his seat, but thrown clear of the wreckage, his katana clutched in one hand. The autopsy would show he'd been killed instantly by the head wound, dying before the crash, spared the knowledge that his aircraft had disintegrated on impact. What Yamamoto couldn't know, in those final seconds, was how his death would reverberate through the Pacific War. Japanese naval morale would never recover. The man who'd planned Pearl Harbor, who'd predicted Midway, who'd understood both America's power and Japan's limitations, that irreplaceable strategic mind was gone. lost because someone in Washington had decided that killing one Japanese admiral was worth risking 16 fighters and their pilots on a 1,000-mile round trip. The American pilots who'd flown the mission, Major John Mitchell leading 16 P-38 Lightnings from Guadalcanal's Henderson Field, had achieved what Japanese defensive planning said was impossible. They'd flown at wave-top height for hours to avoid radar detection. They'd arrived at the interception point at precisely 09:35 hours, exactly as calculated. They'd engaged, destroyed both Betty bombers, fought off the Zero escorts, and returned home with only one aircraft lost. But the real story wasn't the tactical execution. The real story was that America had built a fighter with the range to execute such a mission. They'd developed drop tanks, refined turbo superchargers, created logistics systems that delivered these specialized aircraft to remote Pacific islands. They'd trained pilots to exploit the P-38's unique characteristics rather than fight the way European doctrine dictated. They'd done what Yamamoto had warned Japan they would do: applied unlimited industrial resources to every problem until solutions emerged. The strange twin-boom fighter that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as clumsy and vulnerable had just flown further than any interceptor in history to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor. In doing so, it had validated every warning Yamamoto had issued about American capacity, every prediction he'd made about Japan's inevitable defeat. The P-38 Lightning hadn't just shot down Admiral Yamamoto. It had shot down the last pretense that Japan could match American industrial warfare. The man who'd studied at Harvard had died at the hands of the very industrial system he'd spent years trying to make Tokyo understand. What none of them knew, not the American pilots celebrating their return, not the Japanese officers receiving the devastating news, not the strategists on either side analyzing the implications, was that this single mission would become legendary. Operation Vengeance, they would call it later, though during the war it had no official name. The day American industrial power reached across 435 miles of ocean to deliver personal, precise, unavoidable retribution. Admiral Yamamoto had tried to teach Japan about American capacity. In the end, America taught the lesson with a twin-engine fighter that shouldn't have been able to reach him. The student had become the teacher. The warning had become prophecy. The impossible had become inevitable. The weapon that killed Admiral Yamamoto had been born from desperation and ambition in equal measure. In February 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608, a specification so demanding that most aircraft manufacturers dismissed it as fantasy. The Army wanted an interceptor capable of flying 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and reaching that altitude in 6 minutes. These numbers represented a 50% improvement over existing fighters. Most designers considered the requirements impossible with available technology. At Lockheed Aircraft Corporation's modest facility in Burbank, California, a 33-year-old engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson studied the specifications with the intensity of a man solving a mathematical puzzle. Johnson had joined Lockheed fresh from the University of Michigan, and his analytical mind immediately recognized the core problem. No single American engine could produce enough power to meet the Army's demands. The solution was obvious, radical, and seemingly insane. Use 2 engines. Johnson's design team, working in secrecy that would later become known as the Skunk Works approach, sketched configurations that looked like nothing flying in any Air Force. They considered conventional layouts, push-pull propellers, various boom arrangements. What emerged was a design so unconventional that test pilots approaching the prototype for the first time would invariably ask the same question: "This thing actually flies?" The XP-38 featured twin Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engines mounted in nacelles that extended backward into long booms. These booms supported twin vertical stabilizers connected by a horizontal tail surface. The pilot sat in a central nacelle, positioned directly behind a battery of weapons that would make the Lightning the most heavily armed fighter in American service. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon, all mounted in the nose, all firing parallel streams through the propeller arc. Johnson later admitted to his team, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." On January 27, 1939, Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey, the Army Air Corps test pilot assigned to the P-38 project, took the prototype into the sky above March Field in California. The ungainly-looking machine climbed with authority that shocked observers on the ground. At altitude, it reached speeds that exceeded the Army's specifications. The twin-turbo superchargers, nestled atop each engine and fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level power at altitudes where conventional fighters gasped for air. Kelsey's initial report praised the aircraft's high-altitude performance, but noted concerns about its complexity. Twin-engine fighters were traditionally bombers or reconnaissance aircraft, not dogfighters. The P-38 would require pilots to master multi-engine coordination, propeller synchronization, and systems management far beyond single-engine fighters. Japanese naval intelligence first noted the P-38's existence in mid-1942, when the aircraft began appearing in small numbers over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The reports that reached Tokyo described a strange-looking fighter with unusual configuration but unremarkable capabilities. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most accomplished aces with 64 confirmed victories, later wrote his first impressions of encountering the Lightning over the Solomons. The P-38, first used in combat against the Zeros, appeared to lack any distinctive features other than speed at great altitudes and very high diving speed. The strange Lightnings made their combat debut during the fall of 1942. Soon they were appearing in ever-increasing numbers, often challenging our Zero fighters. What delighted Japanese pilots initially was that American pilots flying these heavy fighters would attempt to dogfight with Zeros. The A6M-0 could outturn anything in the sky, and many P-38s fell to Japanese guns in those early encounters. Sakai observed, "To the great delight of our pilots, the P-38 pilots would attempt to dogfight with the Zeros, which managed to shoot down many of the enemy fighters." Japanese intelligence analysts studied captured P-38 components and interviewed pilots who'd engaged the aircraft. Their assessment confirmed what combat reports suggested. The Lightning was fast in a straight line and could dive impressively, but it couldn't turn with Japanese fighters. Its twin engines made it vulnerable. Twice the target area, twice the maintenance burden, twice the fuel consumption. They concluded it was a design born from American industrial excess rather than tactical wisdom. What Japanese analysts missed was the final line in Sakai's report. It was obvious from the contrast with later combat that the Americans had not as yet learned the most favorable characteristics of the big, heavy P-38, and that the airplane was at first more misused in combat than properly flown. While Japanese pilots celebrated their victories over the clumsy American fighter, the man who would eventually lead the mission to kill Yamamoto was learning to fly in Oklahoma. Major John Mitchell had already accumulated hundreds of flight hours in various aircraft, but the P-38 represented his first experience with a twin-engine fighter. The complexity initially frustrated him. 2 throttles to manage, turbocharger controls, counter-rotating propellers to prevent torque. Systems that required constant attention at precisely the moments when combat demanded focus on the enemy. But Mitchell was a methodical pilot, the kind who studied manuals and calculated optimal tactics rather than relying on instinct. He recognized what Japanese intelligence had missed. The P-38 wasn't meant to dogfight. It was meant to dominate through energy management, using speed and altitude to dictate engagement parameters. The Lightning's twin Allison engines each produced 1,150 horsepower at sea level, but the real magic happened at altitude. The turbo superchargers, driven by exhaust gases, compressed thin, high-altitude air back to sea-level density before feeding it to the engines. This meant the P-38 maintained full power at 25,000 feet, where Japanese fighters struggled with engines designed for lower altitudes. At 30,000 feet, the Lightning was effectively alone in the sky, able to observe, position, and attack at will. The nose-mounted armament solved a problem that had plagued fighter designers since the First World War. Wing-mounted guns required convergence, setting them to concentrate their fire at a specific distance. Too close, and the streams passed on either side of the target. Too far, and they hadn't yet crossed. Pilots had to judge range precisely or waste ammunition. The P-38's 4 machine guns and cannon all fired parallel streams that never converged or diverged. This created a cone of destruction that remained effective from point-blank range to 1,000 yards. Anything caught in that stream faced 800 rounds per minute of 50 caliber ammunition, plus 60 rounds per minute of 20 mm explosive shells. Against Japanese aircraft, designed for maneuverability rather than protection, this firepower was devastating. The A6M0 featured no armor plating and non-self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots who'd learned to exploit the P-38's advantages would dive from altitude, fire a 2-second burst, and climb away before Japanese pilots could react. Those 2 seconds delivered approximately 26 50 caliber rounds and 2 20 mm shells, more than enough to shred lightly built Japanese aircraft. By early 1943, American pilots had learned these lessons through the harsh teacher of combat experience. The P-38 squadrons in the Pacific developed doctrine that played to the aircraft's strengths. Never slow down. Never turn with zeros. Use altitude advantage. Use speed advantage. Strike and escape. Return with altitude and fuel for another pass. What made the P-38 truly revolutionary wasn't its performance in combat, though that would prove formidable. It was the aircraft's range. With standard internal fuel tanks, a Lightning could fly approximately 100 miles before running dry. With external drop tanks, auxiliary fuel containers that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat required maximum performance, that range extended dramatically. In April 1943, engineers at the 5th Air Force Depot in Port Moresby, New Guinea, had been experimenting with larger drop tanks for the P-38. The standard 165-gallon external tanks provided good range extension, but logistics officers calculated that deep strikes into Japanese-held territory would require more. They developed 330-gallon tanks, nearly twice the capacity of standard externals. The problem was weight distribution. A 330-gallon tank filled with aviation gasoline weighed approximately 2,000 pounds. Hanging that much weight on one wing while the other carried a standard 165-gallon tank created asymmetric loading that tested the P-38's structural limits. The engineers solved this by ensuring the tanks were mounted close to the aircraft's center of gravity, minimizing the imbalance during the critical takeoff and climb phases. Major Mitchell, now commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, watched these developments with professional interest. His squadron had recently received P-38G models, the latest variant with improved systems and strengthened airframe. When the special 330-gallon tanks arrived at Henderson Field in mid-April, Mitchell recognized their potential immediately. With these tanks, a P-38 could reach targets 500 miles away, fight for 10 minutes, and return with reserve fuel. 500 miles represented a radius that encompassed Japanese bases that had been untouchable. Rabaul, the massive enemy naval complex, sat within that circle. Bougainville's airfields, the Shortland Islands, targets that Japanese commanders assumed were beyond American fighter range, protected by distance rather than defenses. On April 14, 1943, American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor deciphered a Japanese naval message that would change the course of the Pacific War. The message, encoded in JN25D cipher, detailed an inspection tour by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Departure time: 0600 Tokyo time from Rabaul. Arrival time: 0800 Tokyo time at Ballale Airfield near Bougainville. Aircraft: 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers. Escort: 6 A6M-0 fighters. The message traveled up the chain of command with unprecedented speed. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. Knox to President Franklin Roosevelt. The response came back down with equal rapidity. Get Yamamoto. The mission planners faced immediate challenges. Bougainville sat 435 miles from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the nearest American base with fighter aircraft. The round trip, including maneuvering for combat, would require approximately 1,000 miles of range. No Navy or Marine Corps fighter possessed that capability. The F-4F Wildcat's maximum range was 770 miles. The new F-4U Corsair could manage 1,015 miles, but none were yet operational at Henderson Field. Only the P-38 Lightning could make the journey. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding air operations in the Solomons, called Mitchell to his headquarters. "You've got those special tanks," Mitcher said, pointing to a map where Guadalcanal and Bougainville were marked. "Can you reach here and back?" Mitchell studied the map. He calculated fuel consumption rates, climb requirements, combat reserve, emergency margin. The numbers were tight, impossibly tight. Any deviation from the flight plan, headwinds, combat maneuvering beyond the planned 10 minutes, navigation errors, would leave aircraft ditching in the ocean with empty tanks. "We can reach it," Mitchell finally answered. "Staying there to fight and getting back? That's a different question." "You'll have 10 minutes over target," Mitcher said. "Intercept at 0935 hours. Be there exactly on time, or you miss him." Mitchell returned to his squadron and gathered his most experienced pilots. 18 P-38s would fly the mission. 4 designated as the killer flight would engage the bombers carrying Yamamoto. The remaining 14 would climb to 18,000 feet to intercept Japanese fighters from Kahili Airfield, expected to scramble when the attack began. 2 aircraft would fly as spares, ready to take over if any of the primary fighters developed mechanical problems. The mission required navigation precision beyond anything attempted in the Pacific theater. Mitchell would lead his formation on a roundabout route that avoided Japanese observation posts in the Solomon Islands, flying west over open ocean before turning north toward Bougainville. Total distance: 600 miles outbound, 400 miles returning via the direct route. Flying at 50 feet above the water to avoid radar detection. Maintaining radio silence for 3 hours. Arriving at a specific point in the sky at a specific time to intercept aircraft that had departed 315 miles away. Executing combat while monitoring fuel consumption. Returning across 400 miles of ocean with enough reserve to account for headwinds or emergency maneuvering. The mission that Japanese planners would have calculated as impossible was about to demonstrate that American industrial capacity had redefined possible. The P-38 Lightning, that strange twin-boom fighter Japanese intelligence had dismissed, was about to deliver a lesson in strategic reach that no Japanese commander would forget. The aircraft that would fly Operation Vengeance represented the cutting edge of American aviation technology. Each Lightning cost $120,000, roughly twice the price of a P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. Each required 1.2 million man-hours to produce, consuming aluminum, steel, copper, and rubber in quantities that would have supplied entire Japanese fighter squadrons. Each burned aviation gasoline refined from Texas crude oil, transported across the Pacific in tankers that themselves represented industrial miracles. Yamamoto had toured those Texas oil fields in 1920 while studying at Harvard. He'd seen the derricks stretching to the horizon, the refineries processing crude into the high-octane fuel that would power the aircraft that would kill him. He'd understood what those resources meant. He'd tried to warn Tokyo what fighting such industrial capacity entailed. Now 16 P-38 Lightnings sat on Henderson Field's Marston Matting runway, their twin engines warming up in the dawn of April 18, 1943. Loaded with 330-gallon drop tanks that Japanese engineers had calculated as impossible to develop in time to affect the war's outcome. Flown by pilots trained in tactics that Japanese intelligence said Americans were too inexperienced to master. Guided by navigation calculations that Japanese planners believed exceeded American precision capabilities. The mission was about to prove that American industrial warfare operated by different mathematics than anything Japan had experienced. The mathematics of abundance. The mathematics of spending $2 million worth of fighters and fuel to kill one man. The mathematics of innovation and production operating faster than enemy intelligence could adapt. Admiral Yamamoto, approaching Bougainville at exactly 09:35 hours, had no way of knowing that every assumption protecting him had been invalidated by American capacity he'd witnessed firsthand 2 decades earlier in Texas. At 07:25 hours on April 18, 1943, Major John Mitchell climbed into the cockpit of his P-38G Lightning at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The pre-dawn darkness still clung to the airfield, but the eastern horizon glowed with the promise of sunrise. Around him, 17 other Lightnings were going through final checks, their twin Allison engines coughing to life one by one until the flight line thundered with 144 cylinders firing in synchronization. Mitchell's hands moved through the startup sequence with practiced efficiency. Left engine first, watching the tachometer climb. Right engine next, feeling the aircraft rock slightly as both power plants settled into their rhythm. He tested the turbocharger controls, verified hydraulic pressure, checked that his 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon were armed and ready. Every action precise, every system verified. This mission allowed zero margin for error. In the cockpit behind him, Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. was running through his own checklist. Lanphier would lead the killer flight, the 4 fighters assigned to attack Yamamoto's bombers directly. His wingman, First Lieutenant Rex Barber, sat 2 aircraft down the line, also preparing. Behind them, First Lieutenant James McClanahan and First Lieutenant Joe Moore completed the killer section. Mitchell studied his navigation calculations one final time. The numbers told a story of precision flying at the edge of possibility. 3 hours and 20 minutes to reach the interception point. Flying at 200 miles per hour indicated airspeed, maintaining 50 feet above the water to stay below Japanese radar coverage. Radio silence absolute. Navigation by dead reckoning, compass heading, and calculated timing. No margin for error, missed the target by 5 miles or 5 minutes, and Admiral Yamamoto would land safely at Bougainville. All aircraft, check in. Mitchell transmitted on the squadron frequency. 17 voices responded in sequence. Mitchell waited for the 18th. Killer 3, fuel transfer failure. McClanahan's voice crackled through the radio. Drop tanks won't feed. I'm aborting. Mitchell cursed silently. The mission was losing aircraft before they'd even departed. Understood, Killer 3. Return to base. Seconds later, another transmission. Killer 4. Tires flat. Blown during taxi. I can't take off. Moore's voice carried frustration and disappointment in equal measure. The killer flight had just lost 2 of its 4 aircraft before leaving the ground. Mitchell made a split-second decision. Spare 1 and spare 2. Move up to killer positions. We're proceeding. At precisely 07:10 hours, Mitchell advanced his throttles and began rolling down Henderson Field's Marston matting runway. The P-38 accelerated slowly, burdened by the massive 330-gallon drop tank on one wing and 165-gallon tank on the other. The asymmetric loading required constant correction with rudder and aileron, fighting the aircraft's desire to roll left toward the heavier side. At 120 miles per hour, Mitchell eased back on the yoke, and the Lightning lifted into the tropical morning air. 15 fighters followed him into the sky. 16 had started. 18 had been planned. But 16 was enough, Mitchell told himself. It had to be enough. The formation assembled quickly, Mitchell leading them in a climbing turn toward the west. At 1,000 feet, he leveled off and pointed the nose toward the horizon. Behind him, the killer flight, now led by Lanfear and Barber, with Holmes and Hine as their wingmen, settled into position. The remaining 12 fighters, the covering force, spread into a wider formation above and behind. Then Mitchell pushed the nose down toward the ocean, and the long flight began. Flying 50 feet above the water was an exercise in concentration that permitted no lapses. At 200 miles per hour, the ocean surface rushed past in a blur of white-capped waves and reflected sunlight. Too high, and Japanese radar might detect them. Too low, and a moment's inattention would result in a fighter cartwheeling across the waves in a spray of aluminum and aviation fuel. The roar of the twin Allisons filled Mitchell's cockpit, a deep thunder that would become hypnotic over the next 3 hours. He forced himself to scan instruments, check position, monitor fuel flow, glance at the formation around him. Every 15 minutes, he compared actual fuel consumption against planned consumption. The numbers had to match exactly, or the mission would fail over the vastness of the Pacific. 1 hour passed. The sun climbed higher, transforming the ocean from dark blue to brilliant turquoise. The P-38s droned westward, maintaining strict radio silence. Mitchell checked his watch against his flight plan. On schedule. Fuel consumption nominal. Formation intact. 2 hours passed. Mitchell's legs cramped from holding constant pressure on the rudder pedals to counteract the asymmetric fuel load. His neck ached from scanning constantly between instruments, horizon, and sky. The monotony of ocean navigation tested even experienced pilots' concentration. One moment of autopilot thinking, one slight control input in the wrong direction, and 15 other fighters would follow you into the water. At 09:33 hours, 2 minutes before the calculated interception time, Mitchell pulled back on the yoke and began climbing. Around him, 15 other Lightnings pitched up in unison, their propellers biting into thicker air as they left the relative safety of wave-top altitude. "Drop tanks," Mitchell transmitted, the first words spoken in over 3 hours. His thumb found the release switch. The external tanks fell away, tumbling toward the ocean. Immediately, the P-38 felt lighter, more responsive. Mitchell advanced his throttles to war emergency power, pushing the engines to their limits. The airspeed indicator climbed past 250 miles per hour. The killer flight stayed low, accelerating toward combat speed. The covering force continued climbing toward 18,000 feet, gaining altitude advantage for the expected Japanese fighter reaction. At exactly 0934 hours, 51 seconds before the calculated interception time, Mitchell spotted them. Two tiny dark shapes against the morning sky, perhaps 15 miles distant, flying at 6,500 feet, descending gradually. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, precisely where American intelligence had predicted they would be. And above them, 6 smaller shapes weaving protective patterns. The Zero escort. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high," Mitchell transmitted. "Killer flight, you're clear to engage." Lanfear and Barber pushed their throttles forward and dove toward the Japanese formation. Behind them, Holmes and Hine followed. Mitchell felt the familiar tightness in his stomach that always preceded combat. This was the moment. 3 hours of precise navigation, fuel management, and concentration had brought them to this exact point in the sky at this exact second. The Japanese spotted them simultaneously. Mitchell saw the Zero fighters break formation, some diving toward the killer flight, others climbing toward his covering force. The Bettys, suddenly vulnerable, put their noses down seeking speed and the safety of the jungle canopy. Lanfear found himself engaged immediately by 3 Zeros diving from above. He broke hard left, fighting to reach the bombers before the Japanese fighters could intercept him. The Zeros followed, their pilots executing tight turns that no P-38 could match. Lanfear found himself in a classic turning fight. Exactly the situation doctrine said to avoid. But the diversion was working. While the Zeros focused on Lanfear, Rex Barber had a clear approach to the first Betty bomber. Barber's fighter engineer had set his gun convergence at 300 yards. As the range closed, he centered the illuminated pipper of his gun sight on the Betty's right engine. The bomber was diving now, perhaps 200 miles per hour, trying to reach the jungle. Barber's airspeed showed 350 miles per hour and climbing, closing fast. At 400 yards, Barber pressed the trigger. The P-38 shuddered as 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon opened fire simultaneously. The concentrated stream of bullets and explosive shells reached across the sky in less than half a second. Barber saw his tracers walk across the Betty's wing route into the right engine cowling. The Mitsubishi's engine exploded in a gout of orange flame and black smoke. The bomber's right wing dipped violently as the engine nacelle disintegrated under the concentrated fire. Barber kept his finger on the trigger, pouring rounds into the stricken aircraft. 2 seconds of firing, approximately 60 50 caliber rounds and 4 20mm shells. More than enough. The Betty's wing folded upward, stressed beyond its design limits. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the jungle below. Barber flashed past, so close. He could see figures moving in the bomber's greenhouse nose, then pulled hard on the stick and climbed away. Behind and below him, the Betty carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto smashed into the jungle canopy at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage broke into sections, scattering wreckage across 100 yards of jungle floor. The right engine, already ablaze, ignited fuel spilling from ruptured tanks. Fire engulfed what remained of the aircraft. Yamamoto's body, still strapped in his seat, was thrown clear of the main wreckage by the initial impact. The force of the crash had been terminal, but the 2 50 caliber bullets that struck his head had killed him before the aircraft hit the trees. He died instantly, without pain, still clutching his katana in his right hand. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, flying as Barber's wingman, never saw the Zero that got him. The Japanese pilot, enraged by the destruction of both bombers, dove on the P-38 from above and behind. 20mm cannon shells walked up Hine's fuselage, severing control cables and puncturing fuel tanks. The Lightning nosed over into a steep dive that ended in the ocean 15 miles off Bougainville's coast. Hine had no chance to bail out. Above the chaos, Mitchell's covering force engaged the remaining Zeros in a swirling dogfight that lasted exactly 7 minutes. The Japanese pilots, desperate and aggressive, tried to close to knife-fighting range where their superior maneuverability would dominate. The American pilots, disciplined and well-trained, used speed and altitude advantage to attack in slashing passes, never slowing down enough to allow turning fights. Captain Roger Ames, flying cover at 18,000 feet, watched a Zero climbing toward him from below. The Japanese pilot was good, using every bit of his aircraft's superior climb rate to reach attacking position. Ames let him come, watching the range close. At 1,000 yards, the Zero opened fire with his 20mm cannon. The shells fell short, visible as bright tracers arcing beneath Ames's fighter. Ames waited. At 800 yards, he rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S maneuver, diving away from the climbing Zero. The P-38 accelerated rapidly, using gravity and engine power to build speed the Zero couldn't match. At 400 miles per hour, Ames pulled out of the dive and zoomed back up toward his original altitude, using kinetic energy stored in that high-speed dive to climb faster than the Zero could follow. The Japanese pilot, committed to his climb, found himself suddenly alone at 16,000 feet with an American fighter above him again. Before he could react, Ames dove for a second pass, this time firing. The concentrated stream from 4 machine guns and a cannon shredded the Zero's lightly built fuselage. The Japanese aircraft rolled left, trailing smoke, and spiraled toward the ocean. "All aircraft, disengage," Mitchell transmitted at 0943 hours. "Return to base." The covering force broke off combat and formed up for the return flight. Mitchell counted aircraft as they assembled. 14 fighters joined the formation. Hine was gone. Everyone knew it without needing confirmation. But the mission was accomplished. Both bombers destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto dead, though they wouldn't confirm it until Japanese radio broadcasts announced his death weeks later. The Americans had flown 435 miles, fought for exactly 9 minutes, and were returning home with fuel margins so tight that several aircraft would have to make emergency landings at closer bases. As the formation turned southeast toward Guadalcanal, Captain Thomas Lanfear broke radio silence with a transmission that would become legendary. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." The return flight tested every pilot's nerve. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty as the P-38s droned across the Pacific. Several aircraft showed battle damage from the brief but intense combat. Every pilot monitored his fuel flow with growing anxiety, calculating and recalculating whether they had enough to reach Henderson Field. Mitchell's fuel gauge showed 150 gallons remaining when Guadalcanal appeared on the horizon. Enough for perhaps 40 minutes of flight at cruise power. The formation began its descent toward Henderson Field at 12:10 hours, 3 hours and 27 minutes after departing Bougainville. Total mission time, 5 hours. Total distance covered, approximately 1,000 miles. Total fuel consumed, every drop the P-38s could carry. One aircraft, damaged and critically low on fuel, made an emergency landing at the Russell Islands, roughly halfway home. The pilot walked away from a wheels-up landing on the beach, his Lightning's tanks bone dry. The remaining 13 aircraft landed at Henderson Field in quick succession, their propellers windmilling to a stop on the Marston-Matting runway as engines starved for the last drops of aviation gasoline. Mitchell climbed out of his cockpit on legs that barely supported him after 5 hours in the cramped fighter. His crew chief approached with a clipboard and a question. "How'd it go, Major?" Mitchell looked at the 13 fighters scattered along the flight line, thought of Hine, who wouldn't be coming back. Thought of the 2 Mitsubishi bombers burning in the Bougainville jungle. Thought of Admiral Yamamoto, the man who'd planned Pearl Harbor, who'd predicted his own defeat, who'd studied at Harvard and toured Texas oil fields and tried to warn his government about American industrial capacity. "We got him," Mitchell said simply. 16 of us flew 1,000 miles to get one man, and we got him. What Mitchell couldn't know was that the mission had demonstrated something more significant than the death of one Japanese admiral. It had proven that American industrial capacity had redefined the possible in warfare. Fighters with ranges that Japanese planning considered impossible. Navigation precision that enemy intelligence believed Americans couldn't achieve. Coordination and execution that exceeded anything attempted before in the Pacific theater. The P-38 Lightning, that strange twin-boom fighter Japanese intelligence had dismissed as heavy and vulnerable, had just become the instrument of strategic-level assassination. The weapon that could reach anywhere, strike anything, and return home. The physical manifestation of Admiral Yamamoto's warnings about American industrial power. Japan had lost more than their finest naval strategists that morning. They'd lost the illusion that distance provided protection. They'd lost the assumption that American fighters operated within predictable limitations. They'd lost the man who understood their enemy better than anyone in Tokyo. The man who'd predicted exactly how the war would unfold. The man whose death validated every warning he'd issued. The Americans had sent 16 fighters on a mission Japanese planners would have calculated as suicide. They'd done it to kill one man. They'd succeeded because they had aircraft that Japanese engineers said couldn't be built, fuel that Japanese logistics couldn't match, navigation skills that Japanese intelligence believed Americans lacked, and an industrial base that could afford to risk 16 fighters and their pilots for a single target. Admiral Yamamoto had tried to explain this kind of warfare to Tokyo. In the end, he became the lesson. Shot down by the very industrial system he'd witnessed in Texas 2 decades earlier, killed by a fighter his own intelligence service had dismissed, proving with his death that every prediction he'd made about American capacity was devastatingly accurate. The Japanese search party found Admiral Yamamoto's body at 14:35 hours on April 19, 1943, approximately 27 hours after the crash. Lieutenant Hamasuna Tsuyoshi, leading the recovery team through dense Bougainville jungle, spotted the wreckage from the distinctive tail section jutting above the canopy. What he discovered as he approached the crash site would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Yamamoto sat upright in his seat, thrown clear of the main wreckage but still strapped in, facing toward what had been the aircraft's nose. His white dress uniform was scorched but largely intact. His katana remained clutched in his right hand, with a grip so firm that Hamasuna initially couldn't pry the fingers open. The admiral's face, Hamasuna later reported, maintained an expression of absolute composure, as though death had come so quickly he'd had no time to register fear or pain. The autopsy, conducted by Naval Surgeon Commander Tabuchi, revealed 2 bullet wounds. Both .50 caliber rounds had entered from behind and above, passing through Yamamoto's head at angles consistent with aerial combat. Death had been instantaneous. The Admiral had not suffered through the crash. He'd been dead before the Betty hit the trees, killed by American machine gun fire from a fighter that shouldn't have been able to reach him. Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo received the news via coded transmission at 0200 hours on April 20th. The duty officer who decoded the message initially refused to believe it. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. Dead? Shot down by American fighters over Bougainville? Impossible. The Americans didn't have fighters with that range. The Admiral's schedule was secret. The route was secure. But the message was verified, confirmed by multiple sources. Yamamoto was dead, along with Vice Admiral Ugaki's Chief of Staff and several other senior officers. The second Betty had also been destroyed, though Ugaki himself had miraculously survived the water crash. The Japanese government delayed the public announcement for over a month, attempting to control the narrative and assess the strategic implications. When the news finally broke on May 21, 1943, it hit Japanese military morale like a physical blow. Newspaper accounts described Yamamoto dying heroically in combat, directing operations until the end. They omitted the truth, that he'd been assassinated by a precisely planned American operation that demonstrated terrifying intelligence capabilities and operational reach. What terrified Japanese commanders most wasn't the death itself, but what it revealed about American capabilities. The enemy had known Yamamoto's schedule with precision that suggested they were reading Japanese communications as easily as morning newspapers. They'd sent fighters on a mission that exceeded every known parameter of American fighter range. They'd arrived at the exact time and place to intercept aircraft that had departed from Rabaul over 300 miles away. If the Americans could do this, reach across 435 miles to kill one specific man, what else could they do? What other assumptions about American limitations were equally wrong? Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer at Rabaul who'd helped plan Yamamoto's inspection tour, wrote in his diary on April 21st, "The Americans have demonstrated capabilities we didn't know they possessed. Long-range fighters, precise intelligence, coordination exceeding anything we believed possible. If they can reach Admiral Yamamoto, they can reach anyone. Nowhere is safe anymore." The P-38 Lightning, suddenly, was no longer the clumsy, heavy fighter Japanese pilots had initially dismissed. Intelligence assessments were hastily revised. Combat doctrine was rewritten. The strange, twin-boom American fighter became the subject of urgent tactical studies across Japanese air commands. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, a naval aviator and tactical analyst, prepared a comprehensive report on the P-38 for the Combined Fleet staff in June 1943. His conclusions were sobering. "We initially assessed the P-38 Lightning as inferior to our Zero fighters in combat. This assessment was based on early encounters where American pilots attempted to engage in turning combat, playing to our strengths. Recent operations demonstrate the Americans have learned to exploit their aircraft's advantages rather than fight according to our preferences. The Lightning possesses superior speed at all altitudes, superior climb rate above 20,000 feet, superior dive performance, unprecedented range with external tanks, devastating concentrated firepower, structural strength that allows survival of damage that would destroy our aircraft. Most critically, American pilots now employ tactics that negate our maneuverability advantage. They attack from altitude, strike with overwhelming firepower, and disengage before we can respond. They refuse turning combat. They use speed and altitude as weapons. Against these tactics, executed with growing proficiency, our conventional responses prove inadequate. The report recommended immediate development of Japanese fighters with greater speed and climbing ability, improved pilot training in high-speed combat, and acknowledgement that American industrial capacity was producing aircraft and tactics faster than Japanese intelligence could adapt. None of these recommendations could be implemented. Japan lacked the aluminum, the fuel, the time, and increasingly, the experienced pilots to execute such changes. In the months following Yamamoto's death, P-38 squadrons across the Pacific Theater found themselves flying with new confidence and aggressive doctrine. The aircraft that had been derided as a fork-tailed devil by Germans in North Africa now earned the same nickname from Japanese pilots in the Pacific, though spoken with fear rather than contempt. Major Richard Bong, flying P-38s with the 5th Air Force in New Guinea, would eventually become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories. His tactics epitomized the evolution of lightning doctrine. Use altitude advantage to select targets. Dive with throttles to the firewall. Fire a devastating burst from the concentrated nose armament. Zoom climb back to altitude using speed energy. Never slow down. Never turn with the enemy. Never give them a chance to use their superior maneuverability. Bong's wingman, First Lieutenant Thomas Lynch, described watching his squadron mate destroy a Japanese bomber formation in July 1943. Dick came down from 25,000 feet like a meteor. The Japs never even saw him until his first burst tore apart their lead bomber. By the time they reacted, he was already climbing away, and I was coming down for my pass. We destroyed 4 bombers in less than 2 minutes. They couldn't touch us. The P-38 wasn't just fast. It changed the rules of how air combat worked. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots became increasingly evident in intelligence reports, derived from captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Flight Petty Officer Fujita Iyozo, shot down over New Guinea in August 1943 and taken prisoner, provided American interrogators with candid assessment of Japanese pilot morale. We feared the P-38 more than any other American fighter. The Corsair and Hellcat were dangerous, but we could fight them. The Lightning gave us no chance. They appeared from above without warning. They fired their terrible guns. Then they were gone before we could maneuver. Every mission, we watched the sky above us, knowing that death could come from that direction without warning or mercy. Many pilots developed what we called lightning fear, physical symptoms of stress, when American twin booms were reported in the area. The Japanese response to this psychological dominance was to develop specialized tactics for countering P-38s, but these required discipline and coordination that became increasingly difficult as experienced pilots were killed and replaced with inadequately trained recruits. By late 1943, Japanese fighter units in the Pacific were losing approximately 60% of their pilots within their first 5 combat missions. The P-38's combination of speed, altitude performance, and firepower meant that inexperienced pilots who made mistakes died quickly. The Lightning's success in the Pacific was amplified by its unique suitability for the theater's demands. The twin Allison engines proved remarkably reliable in tropical conditions that plagued single-engine fighters. If one engine was damaged or failed, the P-38 could return home on the other, a capability that saved dozens of pilots' lives over the vast oceanic distances of the Pacific. The concentrated nose armament proved devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft designed without armor protection. American pilots discovered that even brief bursts, 1 or 2 seconds, could destroy enemy fighters. The parallel gun arrangement meant effective fire from 200 yards to 1,000 yards, giving American pilots a significant advantage in deflection shooting situations where wing-mounted guns would have missed. By December 1943, the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific was operating over 200 P-38s across multiple squadrons. The 475th Fighter Group, equipped entirely with Lightnings, became known as Satan's Angels and compiled a kill-to-loss ratio exceeding 5.1 against Japanese aircraft. Their success wasn't just numerical, it was operational. The P-38s provided escort for bombers deep into Japanese-held territory, conducted fighter sweeps that cleared enemy aircraft from contested airspace, and executed ground attack missions that destroyed Japanese infrastructure faster than it could be repaired. Major Thomas Maguire, who would become America's second highest-scoring ace with 38 victories, all in P-38s, described the aircraft's impact on Pacific air warfare in a letter home in January 1944. "The Japanese don't come up to fight anymore unless they outnumber us 3-1. They've learned that our Lightnings can reach any target, strike from any altitude, and return safely. We own the sky above 20,000 feet. We own the tactical initiative. They react to us. We don't react to them. That's what victory looks like." The evolution of American P-38 tactics reached its peak in the fighter sweeps of early 1944, where large formations of Lightnings would range deep into Japanese territory specifically to destroy enemy aircraft. These missions, flown at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, forced Japanese fighters to climb to intercept, burning precious fuel and placing them at disadvantage when combat began. The P-38s would dive, engage, destroy, and climb away before Japanese pilots could effectively respond. Japanese commanders found themselves in an impossible situation. To defend against high-altitude P-38 sweeps required intercepting at altitude, where American fighters held every advantage. To conserve fuel and wait for better engagement conditions meant conceding air superiority and allowing American bombers to operate unmolested. Either choice led to losses Japan couldn't sustain. The production statistics told the story of industrial asymmetry that Admiral Yamamoto had warned about. By war's end, Lockheed would produce 10,037 P-38s of all variants. Each aircraft required approximately 200,000 man-hours of labor, 15,000 pounds of aluminum, and 2,000 individual instruments and components. The United States was producing these complex twin-engine fighters faster than Japan was producing simple single-engine fighters, and doing so while simultaneously building bombers, transports, and training thousands of pilots. Japan's attempts to counter the P-38 through aircraft development failed repeatedly. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighter represented Japan's effort to create a high-altitude interceptor, but chronic engine problems and material shortages meant only 3,000 were ever built. The Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, introduced in 1944, offered performance comparable to the P-38, but arrived too late and in too small numbers to affect the strategic balance. By mid-1944, Japan was producing approximately 1,500 fighters monthly across all types. The United States was producing over 9,000 aircraft monthly, including 300-plus P-38s. The training disparity was equally devastating. American P-38 pilots in 1944 received an average of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100-plus hours in type-specific advanced training. Japanese pilots were entering combat with less than 100 hours total flight time, including less than 20 hours in frontline fighters. The first time many Japanese pilots saw a P-38 in the air was when one was shooting at them. Captain Roger Ames, who'd flown Operation Vengeance and survived the entire war, reflected in a 1998 interview. By 1944, it wasn't even a fair fight anymore. We'd show up with 16 Lightnings, and the Japanese would scramble 30 or 40 fighters to meet us. But their pilots were kids with minimal training, flying aircraft that were worn out and poorly maintained. We'd bounce them from altitude, and they'd scatter like startled birds. The P-38 had gone from being dismissed as clumsy to being absolutely dominant in less than 18 months. That's what American industrial capacity and tactical evolution looked like. The psychological transformation was complete. The twin-boom fighter that Japanese intelligence had initially described as lacking distinctive features had become the most feared American fighter in the Pacific. Its distinctive silhouette, so unusual it was unmistakable even at extreme distances, became associated with sudden, overwhelming violence delivered from unexpected directions at impossible ranges. Japanese pilots developed superstitions about the Lightning. Some claimed the twin-engine fighters were piloted by America's best aces, though in reality, P-38 squadrons had the same mix of experienced and novice pilots as any unit. Others believed the P-38s had radar that allowed them to detect Japanese aircraft at impossible distances, not understanding that American pilots were using altitude advantage and superior training to spot enemies first. The aircraft had become mythologized, transformed from object of derision to instrument of terror. What Japanese commanders understood, even if they couldn't speak it openly, was that the P-38 Lightning represented everything Admiral Yamamoto had warned them about. American industrial capacity producing complex aircraft in vast numbers. American innovation solving problems Japanese engineers said were unsolvable. American training creating pilots who flew with confidence born from knowing they had superior equipment and unlimited resources backing them. The man who'd studied at Harvard, who'd toured Texas oil fields, who'd tried to explain that America fought differently, that man had been killed by the very system he'd described. The P-38 that shot down Admiral Yamamoto wasn't just a weapon. It was a prophecy fulfilled. It was a warning delivered too late. It was proof that everything he'd tried to make Tokyo understand about American warfare was devastatingly, irreversibly accurate. In the spring of 1945, the war Yamamoto had predicted would be lost was ending exactly as he'd foreseen. American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, each objective bringing them closer to the Japanese home islands. Above every battlefield, P-38 Lightnings maintained air superiority that made Japanese resistance increasingly futile. The twin-boom fighters that had been dismissed as clumsy curiosities in 1942 now ranged across the entire Pacific theater with impunity. Major Richard Bong returned to the United States in January 1945 after scoring his 40th and final aerial victory, all achieved in P-38 Lightnings. He'd become America's ace of aces, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in American history. His technique had been simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Use the P-38's advantages, never its weaknesses: speed over maneuverability, altitude over turning fights, concentrated firepower over prolonged engagement. In interviews before his tragic death in a P-80 jet accident later that year, Bong reflected on what made the Lightning so dominant in Pacific combat. Japanese pilots were brave, skilled, and aggressive. Their aircraft could turn inside anything we had. But air combat isn't about turning. It's about killing the enemy before he can react. The P-38 let us do that. We chose when to fight, where to fight, and how to fight. The Japanese could only respond to our initiative. That's not tactics. That's industrial superiority translated into combat advantage. The statistical evidence supported Bong's assessment. By war's end, P-38 pilots in the Pacific theater had achieved approximately 800 confirmed aerial victories against Japanese aircraft, with additional thousands of enemy planes destroyed on the ground. The top 5 American aces, Bong, McGuire, David McCampbell, Francis Gabreski, and Robert Johnson, had collectively scored 154 victories. 2 of those 5, Bong and McGuire, flew P-38s exclusively and accounted for 78 victories between them. But numbers alone couldn't capture the Lightning's true impact. The aircraft had fundamentally changed how air warfare was conducted in the Pacific. Before the P-38, fighter escorts could accompany bombers only to limited depths into Japanese-held territory. After the Lightning entered service with extended-range tanks, no target in the Pacific was beyond American reach. Before the P-38, Japanese commanders could position critical installations at safe distances from American bases. After Operation Vengeance, the entire concept of safety based on distance evaporated. Japanese military records captured after the war revealed the psychological toll. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, who replaced Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The death of Admiral Yamamoto demonstrated American capabilities that fundamentally altered our strategic calculations. If they could reach our commander-in-chief, they could reach anyone. If they possessed intelligence that precise, no communications were secure. If their fighters had that range, no base was safe. The mission revealed that we were fighting an enemy whose resources and capabilities exceeded our most pessimistic assessments." The industrial statistics that emerged after the war confirmed what Yamamoto had tried to explain to Tokyo in 1940. Lockheed's final P-38 production total, 10,037 aircraft. Each Lightning cost approximately $120,000, roughly $1.8 million in modern dollars. The total program cost exceeded $1.2 billion, more than Japan spent on its entire aircraft development programs during the war. But the Lightning represented more than dollars and aluminum. It represented American industrial philosophy applied to military problems. When range was insufficient, engineers developed larger drop tanks. When cockpit heating proved inadequate, they redesigned the environmental systems. When compressibility issues appeared in high-speed dives, they added dive flaps. Every problem encountered a solution, backed by resources that made implementation possible. Japan, by contrast, faced problems without solutions. Insufficient fuel meant training hours were cut, producing inexperienced pilots who died quickly in combat. Aluminum shortages meant aircraft were built with inferior substitutes that reduced performance and reliability. Engine development programs failed because critical alloys couldn't be obtained. Each problem compounded others in a downward spiral that Yamamoto had predicted with eerie accuracy. The man who'd warned them had become the lesson. His death on April 18, 1943, marked the moment when Japanese commanders could no longer ignore what he'd tried to make them understand. The Americans weren't just producing more aircraft. They were producing better aircraft, training better pilots, developing better tactics, and doing all of it faster than Japan could respond. In his final letter to his family, written on April 3, 1943, 2 weeks before his death, Yamamoto had expressed pessimism about Japan's situation. "The Americans grow stronger daily while we grow weaker. Their factories produce in months what takes us years. Their training creates pilots in weeks who fly better than our veterans. I fear the outcome is no longer in doubt. Only the cost in Japanese lives before reality is accepted." That reality arrived in fire and thunder, delivered by 16 P-38 Lightnings that shouldn't have been able to reach him. The museum at Yamamoto's birthplace in Nagaoka, Japan, contains a small exhibition about his time in America. Photographs show him at Harvard, studying in the library. At Texas oil fields, standing beside derricks that stretched to the horizon. In Washington, D.C., serving as naval attaché. In New York's Central Park, chatting with American civilians. Every image documents a man trying to understand the nation he would later fight, trying to measure the industrial capacity that would ultimately defeat his homeland. One display case contains volumes from Yamamoto's personal library, well-thumbed works of Shakespeare, a leather-bound Bible, postcards from across the United States. The exhibit description notes that Yamamoto spoke fluent English, understood American customs, and repeatedly warned Japanese leadership that war with the United States was unwinnable. The final line of the description reads simply, "His warnings went unheeded. His predictions proved accurate." 70 miles south of Nagaoka, in Tokyo's Tama Cemetery, Admiral Yamamoto is buried alongside other Japanese military leaders. His grave receives visitors daily, many leaving flowers and paying respects to the man considered Japan's finest naval strategist. What few visitors realize is that buried with Yamamoto's remains is the katana he'd clutched in his final moments, the sword found in his hand when the recovery team reached the crash site, gripped so tightly they'd had to pry his fingers open. That katana, found in the Bougainville jungle on April 19, 1943, represents the ultimate irony of Yamamoto's story. He'd held his ceremonial sword even in death, a samurai warrior to the end. But he'd been killed by a weapon system that represented everything he'd tried to explain about modern industrial warfare. Not Bushido, not warrior spirit, not tactical brilliance. Raw industrial capacity applied without sentiment or hesitation to military objectives. The P-38 Lightning pilots who flew Operation Vengeance never met Admiral Yamamoto, never studied at Harvard, never toured Texas oil fields. But they flew aircraft that embodied everything Yamamoto had seen and feared during his years in America. The Allison engines were built in Indianapolis factories Yamamoto might have visited. The aluminum came from plants processing bauxite Yamamoto knew America possessed in abundance. The aviation fuel was refined from Texas. Crude Yamamoto had watched being extracted from fields that stretched beyond the horizon. Captain Thomas Lanphier, who led the killer flight that attacked Yamamoto's bomber, later reflected, "We didn't know who we were hunting that day. They told us it was a high-ranking officer, important enough to risk 16 fighters and their pilots. Only after we landed did we learn it was Yamamoto himself. Looking back, I realize we killed the one Japanese leader who truly understood what they were up against. He'd studied in America. He knew what we could do. And we killed him with American industrial power he'd witnessed firsthand 2 decades earlier." The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., displays a P-38J Lightning in its World War II gallery. The placard notes that Lightnings flew the longest fighter mission of the war, achieved the highest American ace totals, and executed one of the most precisely planned operations in military history. Visitors photograph the distinctive twin-boom configuration, marvel at the concentrated nose armament, and read about pilots like Bong and Maguire who became legends flying this unusual aircraft. Few visitors connect the P-38 on display with the Japanese admiral who'd walked Harvard's campus 25 years before the aircraft that would kill him was even designed. Few realize that Yamamoto's time in America, studying economics, touring oil fields, learning about industrial capacity, gave him knowledge that made him uniquely qualified to predict his nation's defeat and uniquely unable to prevent it. The final crushing irony is that Yamamoto's warnings, delivered repeatedly between 1940 and 1943, were validated by his own death. He'd told them Japan couldn't match American production. The P-38 program proved it. 10,000 complex twin-engine fighters built while fighting on two fronts. He told them American innovation would overcome initial limitations. The Lightning's evolution from dismissed curiosity to dominant fighter proved it. He'd told them distance wouldn't protect Japan. Operation Vengeance, a 1,000-mile fighter mission, proved it. Everything he'd predicted came true. The proof arrived in the form of 50-caliber bullets fired from an aircraft built by the industrial system he'd studied, flown by pilots trained by the educational system he'd experienced, guided by intelligence gathered through capabilities he'd warned about. On April 18, 1943, at precisely 8:09:36 hours, above the jungles of Bougainville, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's warnings about American industrial power were validated with mathematical precision. The student of Harvard University, the observer of Texas oil fields, the naval attaché who'd toured American factories, that man died proving himself correct about everything he'd tried to make Tokyo understand. The P-38 Lightning that killed him wasn't just a fighter aircraft. It was a theorem proven, a prediction fulfilled, a warning delivered too late. It was American industrial warfare made manifest in aluminum, steel, and aviation fuel. It was the impossible made routine, the unprecedented made operational, the theoretical made lethal. Japanese commanders who dismissed the twin-boom American fighter as clumsy and vulnerable learned what Yamamoto had tried to teach them: that American warfare wasn't about elegance or efficiency. It was about overwhelming capacity applied without restraint to military objectives. It was about building 10,000 complex aircraft while simultaneously building bombers, ships, and training pilots. It was about solving every problem through industrial excess that made Japanese scarcity irrelevant. The strange twin-boom fighter flew on in Pacific service until war's end, continuing to dominate skies over targets that grew progressively closer to the Japanese home islands. By August 1945, P-38s were flying from Iwo Jima, escorting B-29s to Japan itself, completing the journey Yamamoto had predicted, delivering destruction from industrial capacity he'd witnessed, proving every warning he'd issued. The man who'd stood in Texas oil fields in 1920, watching derricks pump crude that would eventually become aviation fuel, had died 23 years later when that fuel powered fighters across the Pacific to kill him. The man who'd studied at Harvard, learning about American industrial capacity, had been killed by that capacity transformed into combat reach. The man who'd warned Japan cannot beat America had become proof of his own prediction. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died clutching his katana, a warrior to the end. But he was killed by a war machine that rendered warrior spirit irrelevant, a P-38 Lightning that represented everything he'd tried to explain about American industrial power, everything Tokyo had refused to believe, everything that made Japan's defeat inevitable from the moment they chose war with a nation whose productive capacity dwarfed their own. The twin-boom fighter that Japanese intelligence, dismissed, had delivered the ultimate lesson about industrial warfare. Not through tactics or training or courage, but through simple, overwhelming capacity. America had built fighters that could reach anywhere, had trained pilots who could fly them effectively, and had possessed resources to send 16 of them 435 miles to kill one man. Yamamoto had predicted all of it. He'd warned them. He'd calculated the outcome. He'd measured American capacity against Japanese resources and concluded the result was inevitable. In the end, he became validation of his own mathematics, killed by the equation he'd tried to make Tokyo solve before choosing war. The P-38 Lightning flew on. Admiral Yamamoto did not. The lesson was delivered, the prophecy fulfilled, the warning finally, truly understood, but far too late. If you followed this story to its conclusion, you understand that history's most compelling lessons come from deep research and careful storytelling. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the human stories, strategic decisions, and technological revolutions that shaped World War II, told with the precision they deserve. Every script draws from primary sources, military archives, and first-hand accounts to bring you narratives that go far beyond surface-level history. Subscribe to support this work of historical research and join readers who appreciate history told with depth, accuracy, and respect for the people who lived it.